Здесь много иностранных коллег, которые первый раз приехали в Россию и, может быть, не до конца знают, чем занимается журнал издательский «ИД Новое литературное обозрение». Я скажу буквально несколько слов. Хотя название его «Новое литературное обозрение», он давно перерос исследование собственной литературы. Это уже давно междисциплинарный журнал, который ищет новые пути развития гуманитарной и социальной мысли. Это попытка создания или поиска новой научной парадигмы, которая условно можно назвать новой антропологией культуры. И уже очень давно журнал и в своих конференциях, и потом уже в книжной практике занимался исследованием жизненных практик повседневной жизни, всевозможными аспектами антропологического подхода к изучению культуры. Поэтому для нас эта конференция очень важна, очень органична и очень симптоматична. И я хочу сказать, что по результатам этой конференции у нас будет сборник, который будет посвящен вам этой теме. Так что тема города для нас, в общем, очень важная, поскольку именно в урбанистике, именно изучение города позволяет специалистам разных дисциплин объединить свои усилия. Потому что, изучая город, здесь могут быть и историки, антропологи, и литературоведы, и, в общем, историки, все дисциплины здесь так или иначе сходятся в единой попытке понять, что такое, собственно, городская культура, что такое современный город. И мне кажется, что подобная тема чрезвычайно актуальна в том городе, в котором мы сейчас присутствуем, в Москве. Это замечательный объект для изучения. Вот. И на этом, я думаю, краткую речь, если я закончу, и мы начнем конференцию. Хочу сказать, что по традиции главная задача нашей конференции – это не просто делание докладов, а, собственно говоря, дискуссии вокруг докладов. Поэтому, значит, 20 минут докладчик делает доклад, свое выступление, а потом вопросы, обсуждения, дебаты. Вот то, что, мне кажется, составляет ядро и вообще смысловое ядро любой конференции. Вот. Поэтому, да, хочу сказать, что будет конференция, проходит на двух языках, на английском и на русском. Для наших иностранных коллег будет такой, полусинхронный перевод. Ну, а я полагаю, что сидящие все остальные в зале знают хорошо английский, поэтому будут наслаждаться докладами на английском языке. Вот. И я думаю, что пока на этом все. Если у кого-нибудь потом возникнут вопросы по НЛО, его многообразной деятельности, я просто еще хотела сказать, что теперь уже на сегодняшний момент, 20 лет спустя, помимо журнала «Новое литературное обозрение», в издательском доме НЛО еще два журнала существуют. Это «Неприкосновенный запас. Дебаты о политике и культуре» и «Теория моды». Ну и также 25 книжных серий, которые связаны с различными научными и художественными направлениями. Часть книг у нас в соседнем зале можно будет увидеть, но вообще-то можно зайти на сайт НЛО. И я хочу сказать, что в данном случае я рассматриваю новое литературное обозрение не просто как независимое издательство и журнальный центр, но для меня и моих коллег это всегда была площадка, ну, я бы сказала, такой вольный университет, там, где разворачиваются новые идеи, где есть место спору, где просто, может быть, вырабатываются новые образовательные научные критерии. А я сейчас с удовольствием передаю слово нашему первому докладчику, который открывает секцию под названием «Основание урбанистической теории», да, и Ульфу Ханнерцу, Стокгольмский университет, Швеция.
Sorry, my Russian is zero. I didn't understand quite what I was being introduced. And I'll just have to excuse myself and tell you that you should be glad that I won't be speaking Swedish to you. Also, I'm not a Stone Age speaker, no overheads, anything. You'll just have to listen to me and look at me, and I realize I should hold this tighter. My first visit to Moscow, and I'm very pleased to be here. I had sort of hoped that that would happen not at the end of January every year, but still, I'm pleased to be here even in very cold weather, even by Swedish standards. Okay. Since some years back, we have been told more than half of humanity lives in cities. But among those 50% plus, there is clearly room for great diversity. Terms like city and urbanism relate to a very wide range of phenomena which have varied greatly through history and between world regions, and different disciplines develop their own perspectives toward urban phenomena. My own point of view is that of an anthropologist. I became an urban anthropologist now close to half a century ago, when I began my first ethnographic field study in an African-American neighborhood in Washington, D.C. But at that time, in the 1960s, there was as yet little of an urban anthropology. So I and others who began studying cities and city life at the time faced the challenge of pulling together the elements of a new subdiscipline in a useful and reasonably coherent way. If any concept summarizes what anthropology is about, I would say it is diversity. And so one starting point for an urban anthropology is that even now there are many kinds of cities, many different milieux within cities, many different kinds of city dwellers. Different periods of human history have also had their own urban forms. Consequently, we must be very cautious about generalizing about cities and urban life. If diversity is one key concept for anthropology, culture is certainly another. But then culture is a term used in many ways, in and out of anthropology. As it will be important in what I say here, let me summarily say now that what is central is that the human being is a learning animal, born into the world quite incomplete, depending for its life in large part on finding out with other humans what to do, when, how, and why. Culture, then, for anthropologists, is a more or less collective inventory of meanings and meaningful forms. So what I'm interested in here is whether there might be any characteristic kinds of meaning for urban life, any particular ways of managing meaning that goes with the city as a whole. But then I'm also concerned with the uses of the culture concept itself in public discourse and the kind of controversy that can develop around it. These are big questions, but let me begin with one fact that seems to be generally true, perhaps true even by definition. In cities, there is a large, dense population in a limited space. How can such a gross demographic fact be translated into some basic thinking about social forms and ways of thought? One point of departure could be that here, in such a space, are more people than any one of them can at any one time use in the network of more sustained interactions. People do not all know each other. It's characteristic of the city that a fair number are strangers to one another, but in some way contacts will still need to be handled. Classic 20th century observers of urban life commented on this. The Berliner Georg Simmel wrote about it, and the Chicagoan Louis Wirth had a widely cited formulation about urban contacts being typically, and I quote, impersonal, superficial, transitory, and segmental. But then a small scholarly industry has grown up over the years criticizing that formulation by Wirth and others of its kind. The point is that Worth and his contemporaries in the Chicago School of Urban Sociology were inclined to generalize too far. City dwellers have many different kinds of relationships. Some of those and those which anybody among those now less than 50% might have in other kinds of relationships. Those rather minimal, fleeting relationships belong particularly in urban public places, shared spaces, street life. Where you have a large number of people in a limited space, they have to take each other into account in at least minimal ways, simply to coexist reasonably effectively and without too much nuisance. Considering its potential for really monumental chaos, social life in these places may actually seem most of the time remarkably orderly. The term traffic relationships is one I use to refer to those characteristic urban relationships, which are close to being a relationship. Those you have to people who pass on a sidewalk, sit next to in a movie theater, stand behind in a queue. Drawing on Irving Goffman, another major classic American observer of behavior in public places, we may describe them as unfocused co-presences. Thus, in traffic relationships, people avoid stumbling into each other. As pedestrians or drivers, they stop at red lights, and in some societies at least, rather than allowing shapeless crowds to form, they dutifully arrange themselves into lines, waiting to enter or to be served. This is part of a fundamental urban civility, which usually is enough to keep us out of trouble, enough to make the city something other than a wilderness. You might feel that such behavior is so basic that there is really nothing cultural about it. But that isn't quite true. Understanding sort is the proper physical distance between individuals in different contexts varies between cultures. Standing in line is not taken to be common sense in all of them either. Now, one might think that ubiquitous as these traffic relationships are in urban living, they are by their very nature rather marginal, not so important. They may be recurrent in urban experience, but do not inspire much theory. Much of the time that may be true, but they still seem to have an important role in urban imagery, partly because there is an awareness that they could break down, transform themselves into something less insignificant. And they become more complicated by the fact that in many cities, those people in traffic relationships are often not merely personally unknown to each other. That sort of anonymity combines with diversity. Many of those strangers are identified as others with capital O, belonging to some different kind of social and cultural entity. So how does that come about? Analytically, at least, we might distinguish between two possible kinds of bases to this diversity. One of them is internal. As a city concentrates a sizable population in a limited space, it may bring together a critical mass of people with some particular shared characteristic, which in this habitat they can get together to elaborate on culturally, or perhaps we should say subculturally. What can be the hardly noticeable and perhaps mostly hidden away work of one individual or a few in a small community can become a conspicuous and even celebrated mode of conduct when it belongs to hundreds or even thousands. And there may well be not only one such cultural grouping, but many. So an internal cultural diversity grows of particular interests, orientations, lifestyles, for which a smaller local community would not provide a sufficient base. The other type of diversity is externally derived. Some of the very earliest cities in human history may have grown as cult places in the midst of more or less homogeneous agricultural populations. But typically, and more recently, cities have been crossroads places where people come together from different origins with varying characteristics to work and to trade. And the more interconnected the world becomes, and the more easily people move over distances, the more diversity do cities tend to draw together within one local frame, within their shared spaces. Habitually, we may think of only some handful of cities as world cities. But in a literal sense, many cities now take on such a character, and some have done so for quite a long time. I returned just a couple of weeks ago from a brief visit to Penang in Malaysia, a city which one of our other speakers at this conference obviously knows much better than I do. But Penang strikes me as a great example of a globalization which has gone on for centuries and still continues. There were extensive trading networks in this region of the Indian Ocean before Europeans arrived on the scene, and the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British developed them further. By now, in the streets of Penang, you encounter Malays, Chinese, Indians, Europeans, no doubt Australians, and the occasional American as well. There is a burgeoning tourist industry, but the old town has recently very fittingly been declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Like Penang, many cities in their internal diversity reflect not only present-day global flows of people and culture, but also the cumulative order of relationships between centers and peripheries in nations and empires. And certainly this is true of Moscow as well. So analytically, we may first distinguish between internal and external sources of diversity in cities. Yet, in real life, these kinds of diversity mix and merge. For one thing, once a group has established a niche for its particular culture in a city, so that it can be sustained and elaborated with some security, that fact may in itself become more widely known and attract further adherents, migrants from far and wide. They may be intellectuals or artists, followers of a religion, gays whose sexual and aesthetic tastes could find little expression in a more limited environment, or fans of some particular sport. In the early 20th century, subcultures as a concept were mostly understood as localized, face-to-face phenomena, but now they are increasingly transnational. The center may establish itself, locally manifested in particular street scenes, neighborhoods, or other locales, yet perhaps also in the middle of some translocal and quite possibly transnational network, these days connected through jet planes and internet websites. Now let us come back to these traffic relationships. There is usually an assumption of reciprocity in traffic relationships. Participants are expected to share the preference for keeping them minimal, brief, and unfocused. Yet traffic relationships may entail some sort of scanning, and there is always a potential for their conversion into something else. One may turn to observing some of those passing others more closely, or even look to opportunities for engaging with certain of them in less fleeting ways, perhaps turning strangers somehow into acquaintances, even intimates. This may occur more symmetrically or more asymmetrically. The flaneur, a figure known to us not least from Georg's in Berlin a century ago, had already shifted out of the purest traffic relationship somewhat surreptitiously, as his observership mostly remains itself unobserved, incognito. Basically, however, the flaneur is harmless, taking a detached and in large part aesthetic stance toward the human and material surroundings. On the other hand, there may be people desiring to, perhaps even just suddenly inclined to, upset the traffic relationships, to turn them into relationships between predator and prey. They are the people on our minds when rather frequently we understand the city as a dangerous place, a wilderness, a jungle. Somewhere on a dark, lonely street we fear, we may encounter human beasts. It's probably true in most cities as elsewhere that violence is actually more likely to occur between people who already know each other more or less well, even in the intimacy of family life, than between strangers in what were supposed to be those mere anonymous traffic relationships. The motif of the urban jungle may really have a somewhat exaggerated place in our imagination, and in the imagination of some of us more than others. Yet, it's not a matter of pure fantasy. quite a long time ago, at one of the first conferences of what was then the emergent subdiscipline of urban anthropology, I presented the first version of a paper on what I described as the management of danger. The proceedings of that conference were never published, and the paper remained on my desk for a fairly long time before I finally committed it to print. By the time that I did, however, I could also add a paragraph or two, drawing on an experience I'd had just a couple of months after that first presentation of the paper. Walking down a busy street in Kingston, Jamaica, I had been mugged. This happened in broad daylight on a day when Jamaica celebrated its independence anniversary. But evidently my attackers, a small gang of young boys, had identified me as vulnerable, a white person walking alone on a street otherwise populated by blacks and browns. I came away from that urban encounter then, with a shallow knife wound at the back of my neck, and the ironic insight that the perpetrators had unwittingly found for themselves an expert victim and generally presented me and my research with a case study. Evidently, I was not quite expert enough, as I had indeed become a victim. Still, I had prepared for the event by carrying very little money, and just a moment before the mugging occurred, I had indeed regretted that walking at a slightly faster pace, I had unthinkingly overtaken that gang. It would have been smarter, I realized, to have them in front of me rather than behind me. And in that thin slice of time when they surrounded me, I had quickly but surprisingly calmly considered the alternatives. To fight back, to try and run away, or to shout for help. I choose the latter. People came to my assistance, my attackers scattered into the alleys, and fairly quickly the self-organizing order of traffic relationships had been restored. Now that was precisely the kind of phenomena that my conference paper had in large part been about in the first place. Coming at the time when I wrote it from my 2 years of ethnographic field study in a low-income inner-city black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., I had been struck by the fact that a certain concern with danger in their environment had been a part of everyday life among neighborhood people. This was basically something local, constructed largely from their personal experience and the stories of their friends, neighbors, and kinspeople. And the street wisdom which grew out of it was also something local. Walking my walk and talking my talk, as the expression went for minding one's own business, entailed various kinds of practical recipes for conduct, as well as some quite concrete mapping of people, places, times, and situations. The management of danger consisted in no small part of an application of such street wisdom, a kind of more actively defensive extension of the common sense rules for traffic relationships. It was also a rather individual approach to urban danger. Once we take a wider perspective toward the notion that urban danger can result from the presence of strangers, however, we can see that city dwellers may also take a variety of more organized steps toward controlling traffic relationships. Police officers on street patrol are obviously one of them. But in urban ethnography, there are also the classic studies of the so-called urban villages, where neighbors know each other and where strangers are informally but closely watched and not particularly welcome. In an intensified form of spatial restrictiveness, there are neighborhood vigilantes and tough street gangs protecting their turfs. In a higher status variety, which has spread through much of the world since the late 20th century, there are the gated communities, which may offer the residents some range of costly special services, but where precisely those gates tell us that traffic relationships inside them are not for everybody, that strangers are denied access. Once we begin to consider such conspicuous, large-scale organized social arrangements alongside the miniature practicalities of street wisdom, we may get a sense that the management of contacts with strangers is in fact not such a marginal ingredient in the experience of urban life. And then again, ideas of urban danger often go with diversity. Within one's own group, one is more likely to have the cultural skills to read real warning signs and not to misread things which actually offer no such messages. But when the strangers are conspicuously capital O others, when difference is dramatically available to the senses but not particularly well understood, there is the risk that signs are misinterpreted, that difference is rather symbolic violence, which is then mistaken for a threat of real violence. Moreover, there is another influence in shaping the imagery of urban wilderness, which must also be taken into account in the early 21st century, probably more than ever before. It has to do with the interaction between urban experience and media experience. As the media now operate as major agents in mediating between the global and the local, notions of urban danger can now also be partially penetrated, hardly everywhere, but in many of the world's large cities, by the imagery of local terror. The notion of the presence of strangers and the prevalence of anonymity in the urban habitat are a source of danger is obviously a complicated and multiform one, varied both in sources and manifestations, ranging in its cultural forms from the recipes of street wisdom to the newly created fantasies of urban folklore. Yet surely we shouldn't become wholly preoccupied with the dark sides of urban living. Risk is something that often goes together with possibility, with opportunity. Again, a century ago, Georg Siemens Planner already engaged in a kind of quiet celebration of the range of experiences the city had to offer. This involves a certain potential even at the level of how city dwellers can assemble their social relationships. I referred to at the outset to the fact that the city contains more people than anyone can use at any one time in the network of more sustained interactions. That, however, also offers the possibility that one can make changes in that network, drop some relationships, add new ones. It has been another theme in urban anthropology and sociology to portray the kinds of settings which allow people to mingle and engage in a sort of scanning, to try out new contacts in circumstances which are a bit more open. The European Café has long been a prominent setting of this type, which has spread more widely over the world. But then the possibilities of urban life are there at the cultural level as well. Robert Park, founding father of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, suggested in one classic formulation that the city could be seen as a, and I quote, a mosaic of little words which touch but do not interpenetrate. This mosaic metaphor is a recurrent one in portrayals of diversity, but it may often be misleading. There seems to be more room for penetration, for mobility between these little worlds, for such a mobility as a characteristic experience of the inhabitants of the large city. The opportunity with such an urban setting presents then is that of getting to know more of a wider cultural inventory, more meanings and meaningful forms out of that diversity which is brought together here. One may happily seize on that opportunity, or at least some of it, but one may also see it as something mostly of nuisance value. I want to bring in one old and very multifaceted concept here, which has come to new life in scholarly debate in recent years, the concept of cosmopolitanism. It's a concept which carries the burden of a varied history in different contexts of time and place. What I will note here is that over the past 20 years, the concept with its roots in antiquity has found a new relevance, not least in the context of increasing global interconnectedness. It's a concept, however, which turns out to be used in two rather different senses, with rather imprecise relationship between them. One of them is more political and civic, involving a sense of responsibility for humanity and for the world. We may term that cosmopolitics. In the other sense, cosmopolitanism is more cultural, aesthetic, and experiential, involving a stance toward diversity, and it's mostly the latter that I'm concerned with here. When I first started thinking about cosmopolitanism myself some 25 years ago, I had in mind the more conscious valuing of diversity for its own sake, a matter of sheer pleasure, diversity in art, music, literature, food, people, whatever. It was an expansive mode of meaning management, which seemed to me to take on increasing significance as more of the global cultural inventory was becoming more and more accessible. Fairly frequently in writing on cosmopolitanism too, there's been a strong assumption that cosmopolitans are travelers, gaining their experience of diversity and their ability to deal with it by moving between places. When I come from almost half the world away, from Sweden to Malaysia, to enjoy the sights and sounds and tastes of Penang, pass by the temples of many world religions, inspect the old homes of local merchant dynasties turned into museums, and savor the unique Nonya cuisine, I'm indulging my own cosmopolitan demons to the fullest. As the interest in cosmopolitanism has grown among anthropologists and in other disciplines, however, a number of studies have made me increasingly aware of the significance of a more modest, everyday cosmopolitanism. It entails a skill of handling diversity as a practical matter and the confidence in one's ability of doing so. It doesn't have to involve an appreciation of diversity for its own sake, only a recognition of it as a fact of life, and a largely instrumental stance toward dealing with it. Such skill may involve specific knowledge, a sort of concrete recipe knowledge for dealing routinely with particular situations, or it may be a more generalized preparedness for coming across new and unfamiliar challenges and figuring them out in some more improvisational fashion. This kind of cosmopolitanism is not so much an ism, a conscious program, an agenda. Perhaps we should rather term it something like cosmopolitanity as a quality, a state of mind. Whatever we choose to call it, it may occur among people who for one reason or other travel and have to adapt to new circumstances because of that. Yet it doesn't have to involve travel, because in these times especially, you don't have to move to encounter diversity. Diversity may just come to you, particularly as others have been mobile and landed on our doorstep. In cities, obviously, are places where that tends to happen. So they become prime sites both for the deliberate and intellectual and aesthetic search for cosmopolitan experience and for the acquisition of everyday cosmopolitan know-how. To what extent people will actually develop such practical cosmopolitan attitudes and skills, however, and to what extent they will really have a good chance of doing so, may depend on the nature of their particular urban environment. One scholar was recently given some thought to this is a well-known urban ethnographer, Elijah Anderson, who has in large part devoted his attention to black street life in American cities. And he has written on this, especially on his hometown in Philadelphia in the US, in an essay, and now most recently a book named The Cosmopolitan Canopy, which I would recommend, although I don't really have a chance to go into it much here. Now, the notion of cosmopolitan canopy is central here, and under the cosmopolitan canopy, Anderson argues, people watching engages people in doing their own so-called folk ethnography. As Elijah Anderson concludes, when people are repeatedly exposed to the unfamiliar order under such circumstances, they have the opportunity to stretch themselves mentally, emotionally, and socially. Okay, I have to skip some parts here. Perhaps I can just conclude by saying something about the notion of culture again, as I said at the outset that I would do so. There was a time when culture was a notion occurring mostly among the well-educated within the confines of their scholarly and intellectual and aesthetic preoccupations. Now this is no longer so. In recent times, it and other concepts deriving from it have seemed to be just about everywhere, from public commentary and political agitation through organizational consultancy to commerce and advertising. Perhaps one would imagine that those of us who've long been occupied with the questions of culture in research and in policy should now be very pleased with the current spread of something one might term culture speak. It would seem that other people are finally realizing that we are concerned with something that's after all worthwhile and important. But some of us have tended to be rather worried about this. Rather frequently these days the notion of culture shows up in context of discord. Culture clash, culture conflict, culture wars, and so on. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that frequently we are now talking about the interfaces between cultures. And there is one version of that, this usage, which has been described among anthropologists as cultural fundamentalism. It suggests that in one package, human beings are by nature culture bearers. Cultures are distinct and incommensurable. Relations between bearers of different cultures are intrinsically conflicted. It's in human nature to be xenophobic. That's all in the package of cultural fundamentalism. And the particular kind of cultural determinism also tends to go with these ideas. Human beings are assumed to be molded by one particular culture at a very early age, and thereafter they're supposed to become a sort of cultural robots. This kind of cultural fundamentalism is now fairly widespread and tends to serve as an alternative doctrine of exclusion from old-fashioned races. Under such circumstances, there would be some people, even in anthropology, who feel that we should do without the culture concept. I'm afraid this is an ostrich response. The problem will not go away just because some rather small group of academics decide to banish a word from their own vocabulary. We would do better to keep a critical eye on the varieties of culture speak, both among ourselves and in society at large, and try to blow our whistles when usage becomes questionable or even pernicious. But in any case, to conclude, even now cities offer us as scholars in the human sciences the nearest thing that we have to something like laboratories for the study of cultural processes. With their concentrations of human life, with their many varieties of social relationships ranging between intimacy and anonymity, generating new internal cultural diversity and at the same time bringing diversity together from many outside sources, cities remain prime local sites for cultural blending and cultural creativity. This may indeed be times when new modes of communication shape cultural conditions which the early 20th century classics of urban thought couldn't have envisaged, when cities rather paradoxically also become neighborhoods within what Marshall McLuhan a half-century ago strikingly named the global village. Much more could be said about that. Yet again, as Homo sapiens continues to become more and more a species at home in city streets, we have to keep observing and debating the modes of life and thought emerging in that atmosphere.
My question, or not my question, my comment has to do with Lenore and Flannery. Benjamin wrote about Lenore as a detective, and there is that wonderful story in the middle of the 19th century by Edgar Allan Poe, The Man of the Crowd, which in many ways identifies what you talk about, sort of this, the management of, or not the management, but the navigation of the city from the perspective of someone who doesn't know how to read the stranger. And the story, in fact, begins with the lines, this book does not allow itself to be read. So I just wanted to comment on the crowd. Yeah, the crowd of the city, which does not permit itself to be read. In fact, that line about the book not permitting itself to be read is given in German. Why just a comment. So on reading the crowd, how difficult. So Poe talked about this dilemma in the middle of the 19th century.
Well, I take it as a comment, so I really shouldn't need to respond at all, but certainly, I mean, you do have a number of very intriguing, I think, fairly early commentators on this kind of thing, and not least crowd behavior, which of course is a fairly good sign of the way that this is regarded as rather threatening, not least at that time when cities were really mushrooming. But I think also, apart from a few people like Elias Kennedy and so on who have discussed the crowd, it seems to me that much of urban theory is not as well developed as urban imagery, folk urban imagery on these kinds of things.
In fact, this Lanour decides to follow what may be a criminal. He decides to follow him precisely because he cannot read him, his physiognomy.
I have a question for you. Thank you for the talk regarding methodology, in anthropological methodology in this cosmopolitan world you described. I come from New York and I'm making a study here in Moscow. And I should say that I'm like a really, really old anthropologist because I don't actually speak the language. So, which is interesting for me. But it's allowing me to understand a lot about these traffic relationships and the concept of cosmopolitanity, this everyday interaction is something that I'm very interested in. And this encounter with difference is something that I study. So my question is about how to deal with the limitations of the urban theory that I have. I come from New York, and where Jane Jacobs is the queen of everything. And I reach Moscow and realize the limitations of that theory, where a word for neighborhood doesn't even really exist. So I guess what kind of methodology can help me to generate some theory to deal with this huge gap in my experience of everyday traffic relationships and the theory that I have coming from where I come from. I don't know what Moscow urban theory is. I should learn. It will help me today. But just methodologically, I have a short amount of time, how to deal with that, I mean, maybe from your experience.
Well, that sounds like an absolutely fascinating study that you're doing, so I'd like to know more about that. I would certainly think of it as a major handicap for any ethnographer not to speak the native language. I think possibly in a way studying, street behavior, that may be a slightly less difficult problem than it might be in other kinds of social conduct, because after all, much of street behavior is non-verbal, and so one can observe whatever else is there. Well, I would think, the point is to read these urban classics like Jane Jacobs, like the Chicagoans from the first half of the 20th century, people like Simbel, and take them into these new environments, turn them into comparative frameworks, which they certainly weren't from the beginning, whether the authors realized that or not. So to develop a comparative study of street behavior. I was just in contact with some graduate students in Switzerland who are doing this kind of thing in African contexts, and it's really, I think, quite interesting. Just one small thing which just come to my mind when you say that you come from New York and are doing this in Moscow. street behavior in some ways isn't quite as non-verbal as it used to be, and it was really in Greenwich Village, I think, that I first started worrying about all these people wandering about in the streets, and it seemed to me were talking to themselves, sort of, and that to be a kind of sign of worry. This was at the beginning of the cell phone, sort of, and then I realized what was going on, and that this had become sort of one other kind of distraction of street life, and in traffic relationships generally. I mean, I worry a great deal when I see car drivers talking in their cell phones while they are driving, sort of. Something that's illegal in some places and not in others. But so street life also changes. And I think, really taking traffic relationships seriously and studying their cultural varieties in different national contexts or whatever, that's, to me, still a very open field.
Just a comment. Yeah. There's a sociologist at the Illinois Institute of Technology who teaches primarily architects and engineers. And she has them, as part of the methodological training, study fish at the Chicago Aquarium and primates at the zoo, precisely so that they can have stripped away issues of ideology, social norms, and all of that sort of thing, to focus on precisely how it is they are gesturing to one another and in fact engaging in their traffic. And so at a kind of extreme outer point, that I think could possibly be of use, not only to you, but I think to many sociologists or anthropologists who are often overwhelmed by ideology as they try to look at the city.
That's another comment which I just agree with.
My question actually is about ideology. What's your, what do you think about the discussion that took place in 1960s and 1970s among so-called cultural relativists, Clifford Geertz for one, and those who are trying to object his take on kind of absolutely equal cultures that one can observe and describe, or the cultures understood as absolutely equal. And I'm reminded of one particular line of criticism according to which, although it's very difficult to differentiate between ideological predilections or ideology at work when it comes to particular society, an anthropologist must work really hard to discern real values and real attitudes that are at work in the life of a particular community. So do you think it's feasible to differentiate the values that are put to use by power and the values that the community, in quotation mark, kind of cherishes?
Well, that's a very big question, and I'm not sure it's something that I can really cope with in a moment. First of all, let me say that I think Clifford Geertz was a bit more complicated than that sort of. I mean, he had this famous lecture on anti-relativism, which I think makes sense, especially for the generation of Americans to which he belonged, which had been used to Cold War anti-communism and anti-communism in the US, that you can be against the version of anti-communism you had in the McCarthy era without being a communist yourself. And I think anti-relativism was that kind of thing, where you don't need to be an out-and-out relativist to be against the anti-relativism, which is frequently sort of shared prejudice and ethnocentrism, which not least anthropologists, I think, have been continuously struggling against. Now, I think with an increasingly interconnected world, it becomes rather more difficult to be a real relativist if there ever were any sort of, because when there is so much interaction and where people, much to a certain extent, develop shared rules of the game, I think you have to sort of come down on one side over these kinds of conflicts. You can look at this in terms of the conflicts over gender rules, for instance. I mean, how many people would now agree that Saudi Arabian culture in terms of gender relationships is fine because that's for the Saudis to decide, and frequently, of course, it really leaves with 50% of the Saudis to decide it, and the other 50% supposedly have to sort of go along with the culture. So I think, out-and-out cultural relativism is getting harder and harder to maintain. At the same time, I think the battle against ethnocentrism should, at the same time, go on. Now, I'm sure that doesn't answer your question exhaustively, but that's what I come up with for the moment.
Just probably it's a little bit too big a question, but when I listened to one talk, I thought about different cities in terms of inattention between social mobility, which attracts people to the cities, and social stratification. In Moscow, perhaps it's a little too visible. This gap between the rich people and the poor people, and different social stratas, which are somehow flux, because just we're in a very interesting position now, because the situation changes all the time. But in other cities, say in Paris and London, in a way it's less visible, at least to foreigners, but it does exist. And there are quite a lot of these secret, very rigid social barriers between them. How anthropologists and urbanists, deal with this problem? Because I think this is different balance between different tension in different cities between these. This is the axis, between mobility and stratification.
Well, I think, again, one would have to deal with in terms of the variety of actually existing conditions. It's pretty classic motif, as you say, that you come to the city because you want to move up in the world, and much of the classic theoretical literature about social mobility is about upward mobility. It's not about downward mobility. And I think one has nowadays to cope with both of these possibilities. I think much of the tremendous urbanization in the global south, which accounts for much of the fact that urbanites are now more than 50% of the human population, are people who come to cities perhaps because they hope to be socially mobile, but partly because that's their last hopes. There is so little chance of having a reasonable life, even surviving in some rural areas, that you just escape to the city and hope at least to get food for the day, possibly even a roof over your head, and not quite certainly that either. And there is not least a book by a gentleman named Abdul Malik Simone, of somewhat strikingly indeterminable nationality and background, or discipline background for that matter either, not quite an anthropologist. But he's written about third world urbanization, or global south urbanization, especially in Africa, in ways which I think are very thought-provoking in this regard. Then let me also mention one small complicating fact. Much of this mobility to the city is now transnational mobility, people moving from one continent to another. And one of the interesting facts about that, I think, is that some of the people who do hope to be socially mobile are perhaps financially mobile in that they move from a very poor country to a rather richer country and make more of an income, and at the same time they are downwardly mobile in terms of their qualifications. You have well-educated Filipinos, even with academic degrees, becoming domestic maids in North America and in the Arabian Peninsula and that kind of thing. And this is a calculation people may now make, that as long as they earn some money, you know, they can accept being downwardly mobile, at least to begin with, sort of, in their mobility. So again, I mean, you know, these things work out in different places.